we can start. I want to welcome each one of you and representing our counties. At the same time, I want to welcome all the elected officials if they are amongst us. I know one Commissioner Manning is with us here. And I want to introduce our speaker, Rebecca, that is well known to most of us. Almost all of us, we know Rebecca and her office. Any particular time of the month, we receive at least how much we're going to get for tax, research, and several updates. So Rebecca is not a stranger to us. She's very familiar to each one of us. Uh-oh. It's sleeping again.
That's okay. I can just go ahead and get started.
Rebecca Troutman is the 24th, this is her 24th year with the North Carolina Association of County Commissioners, a non-profit advocacy organization of all 100 counties. Rebecca serves as the Intergovernmental Relations Director, and she is registered lobbyist with the North Carolina General Assembly. She represents county interests on issues relating to mental health, human services, state-county budget, and tax and finance. Rebecca coordinates and oversees the association's research efforts and is responsible for analyzing tax, finance, and expenditures impacts on proposed registration and administrative changes. Rebecca has both a BA in political science and MBA in public administration, both from North Carolina State. And my request to each one of us, and even invite some of our friends who are not here, to make sure, to make a point that at least December, during the winter conference, let's come and bid farewell to Rebecca, as yesterday you heard that she'll be retiring. So December will be her last conference with us. Come and let's bid her farewell. Before Rebecca comes in here, please remember our evaluation forms to put in the box as we leave. And at the same time, remember the tags to put in the boxes, because we'll have rough draw from the tags. So put those tags in the boxes. Rebecca.
Thank you, Frank. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
They've given us lots and lots of time this morning to give legislative updates. You know, the league's next door, and here we are with the counties. So I really would like this as interactive as possible. If you have any questions about any pending legislation out there or any other statewide issue, please stop and ask any questions, make any comments, because I really would like it interactive. As you know, we're with the County Commissioners Association, representing all 100 counties. The name of our association is a little bit of a misnomer, because we're actually an association of counties. It's the counties that pay the dues, but it's our board of directors that oversees the association, and they're all elected officials, we are happy to say. I want to spend a couple of moments talking about actually how legislation happens in the General Assembly, because I know sometimes we use terms that can be confusing, so I want to talk about kind of the process and how North Carolina's General Assembly differs from all others. And principally, there is no required adjournment date. So they can stay as long as they would like, unfortunately. In most other states, it's even in their constitution that they can only, they can only sit for 90 days or 60 days or every other year or something like that. None of that is in North Carolina, so they can come in. Supposedly the short session, we're still going on. They are talking about actually adjournment next week. They have so much on their plate. Very little got accomplished this week that it'd be hard pressed to see that they go home, unless they just decide, okay, we're going to put off the very tough issues until the long session when they reconvene back in January. So that's kind of the difference in the sessions, and again, that's unusual for most states, the long session and the short session, because there is no adjournment date. Long session, of course, anything is up for grabs. Any legislation can be introduced by any of the members. The short session is very, very different from that, in that the only things that are eligible are those bills that passed in one of the houses called crossover last session, so that's eligible, so that's the only thing eligible. Anything coming out of the study committees in the interim, and of course anything doing with budget and tax, because the principal purpose of the short session is to tweak the second year of the biennial budget for the state. And they are operating, as you know, past July 1, we came and went without a new budget in place, but they're operating under the budget that was actually set in place last year when they adopted the 2-year biennial budget for the state. So focus on tweaking the budget in the short session, and as you know, they've also just raised all these other issues, a host of controversial issues within the short session. So the budget process, the Senate and the House change biennially about who will be in charge of initiating the budget once the governor's proposal gets over to one of the chambers. In this biennium, it is the Senate, so that's why you see the Senate bill out there with that. And with regards to revenue availability, and this is a bit different from a lot of other states as well, after some of the debacles in the early 80s and 90s, when the state did not meet any of the revenue targets because they were rather optimistic, we might say, there was an agreement there that in fact with the Office of State Budget Management and the governor's direction, fiscal research under General Assembly's direction, that they would come together and agree upon revenue availability. And so that's what they work on in the roughly $21 billion budget. In terms of the enactment process, again, the short session, very limited scope of what actually can be done. You start with the bill actually being introduced by a member. That's called the first reading, because you have to have 3 votes. The first reading is really reading it into the floor. Everybody agrees that, yeah, let's consider that. Then it's assigned into a committee. And that's where the fun begins, because that committee can take that bill and change it any way they want. They can amend it in any way, and then they have to vote on it. And they have 3 options. They can vote favorably with, of course, any amendments they want to move forward. They can give it an unfavorable report, which means that bill is dead. Or they can give it kind of a stake in the heart, but not all the way pushed through, and that's favorable without prejudice, saying, we really don't like this, but we're going to go ahead and send it to the floor for its consideration. And that's where it goes for its next 2 votes, called the second and third reading moving forward. And of course, if it passes one chamber, it has to be enacted by the other chamber before it becomes law. And of course, then it has to be signed by the governor. Are you getting feedback? Okay. Well, I don't even need it on. I can yell at it. And so, in many times, you'll have a competing bill with the same bill number looking differently in both chambers, because again, that same process in the second chamber goes to committee, they can amend it, they can change it completely, and so then they work out the differences in conference if they don't agree to the changes once that bill comes back from the other chamber. And so in a conference committee, they agree, okay, this is what it's going to look like. When they bring it back, and it has to have floor votes again, because now it may look different, in that case, that the conference report cannot be amended like the bill originally on the floor. The conference is up or down. And that's the same process for the budget, because remember, it's a bill too, it's legislation. So that's the way it's supposed to work. But in many instances, it works like this. You start a bill, it looks like a little dog. It gets to committee, all of a sudden it's a really big dog. Take it to the floor, oh, now it's a cat. Send it over to the other chamber, oh my goodness, it's the president of founding father of our country. Goes to conference and it comes back, well, maybe it's a study of Pluto. Kind of related to a dog, but not entirely. And so this is how the process works, especially in the short session. Because again, the only thing that's eligible is that crossover bill that passed one house, but has not been enacted or perhaps even considered in the second house. So that bill is eligible, and boy, that bill can turn into the founding father of our country in a snap. And here's an example of that. Doing Senate Bill 78, it came over from the Senate in what it was fairly uncontroversial. It was going to amend state contract review law, some technical corrections, as it were. So a little bit of a PCS in committee at the Senate, passed unanimously in the Senate, and then it got stuck in the House in Rules. And Rules is one of the committees where it goes to sit until leadership decides what they want to do with this bill. And in this case in the House, what they decided is they're going to turn it into the founding father of our country, completely different, rewrote the whole thing, called a PCS, Proposed Committee Substitute Rules. And all of a sudden, we had to deal with something where our counties would be required to pull from their tax records all of the personal information of law enforcement officers and some of the judges and DAs at their request. And oh, by the way, we'd have to do it upon enactment of the law. So think about how difficult that would have been. Well, of course, we immediately went and worked with the bill sponsor, Representative Malone out of Wake County. What he was trying to respond to, you may recall that district attorney's father was actually kidnapped and taken to Georgia, and it was ordered by a cell phone in a jail or prison, I can't remember which one. The person was incarcerated. So in order to protect that, even though in the committee hearing itself, even the committee chair said, well, this won't fix that issue, will it? And they even had the woman, the district attorney there, in favor of this bill, the second hearing. But it passed out of judiciary, and it expanded it to all county and city websites. So now you're talking about registered deeds records, those formal records that our mortgage and banking industry rely upon to actually do house sales and closings and such. So of course then they jumped into the fray, and then we turned it into an examination of what used to be the ninth planet, I guess, Pluto. So anyway, that's kind of the cycle of legislation, especially in the short session. We always have to be on our toes because they can take a bill that's seemingly innocuous and turn it into something that can be of a huge impact to our counties. And here's an example of that. So when we talk to PCS, that's our little code language, that it's completely changed coming out of that. Moving into the short session, as I mentioned, the principal focus is around tweaking the budget. So all of the focus this year was on how are we going to raise teacher salaries. And you may recall that the governor and the President Pro Tem, Senator Berger from Rockingham, as well as the Speaker of the House, Tillis from Mecklenburg County, all agreed, I think it was back in February, that they were going to enhance teacher salaries by tweaking the second year of the budget, but the focus was also going to be raising all of the beginning teacher salaries up to a certain amount, $33,000 and up to $35,000, I think, in the second year. So that was a huge driver of the discussion. Also in terms of Medicaid reform. And last year's budget, there was a provision that directed the Department of Health and Human Services to bring back a plan to fix the broken Medicaid system we have here in North Carolina. So what was that going to look like? Was it going to be all managed care, or was it going to be this new acronym, Accountable Care Organizations, which is a voluntary network of providers? And of course, then we had fracking in terms of the environmental issues, and all of a sudden what happened to Dan River, coal ash became a big driver as well. So that's kind of the legislative drivers. With regards to political drivers, we're in an election year, and that means every member of the General Assembly is up for re-election. So huge implications there. As we know, our House Speaker is also running for Senate, for U.S. Senate, so that impacts the dynamics, especially in the House, because now you have all of these other House leaders vying for speakership come next January. So how do they position themselves in terms of their members vis-a-vis to get their support when they vote on the House Speaker? And one of the issues that we've had to deal with, because we had such a huge change in the makeup of the General Assembly, most of them are either freshman or sophomore classes serving one or their second terms. They've never had to deal with a short session, all the tensions and back and forth maneuverings of these PCSs, taking a little dog and all of a sudden we're studying Pluto. And so how do you manage in those dynamics when you've not seen it, and you may be chairing a committee for the first time being a sophomore? So that's been a huge issue. So I want to talk about something that I know that y'all have heard about, and this is House Bill 1224. Here's an example where they took something that was actually adopted in the House, proposed this year. You can tell that by if it's got a really high number, 1224, as you saw the other one was 78. No, I'll read that, the weird one. So it was actually introduced in this short session. It was able to do so because it had some tax implications for the state. But what was cobbled together when it came over to the Senate was that there were a couple of senators who promised their counties that they would pursue additional sales tax authority on their behalf. And so we always applaud that, because one of the driving legislative goals for the association, based on what our county members have adopted, that was to get you additional and diverse revenue sources. So that was good. Unfortunately, the version that, and we were given the heads up, hey, we're going to give you some new sales tax authority. Well, that's great. Can we sit down and look at the language? And when we did, it was like, can we work on that a little bit? What it would do, and I'm using the articles set forth in the general statutes under 105, GS 105, which is the entirety of the tax statute for both counties and the state. So I'm referencing the articles, and y'all know that in fact, for about, I guess about 5 or 6 years, all counties have had the ability to enact a transit tax. The 6 largest counties, as a part of a transportation authority, could do it at 50 cents, and the rest of us could do it at a quarter of $100. And so what this would do would be restructuring that particular article, Article 43, by creating a subsection, Article 43A, which would allow our counties to enact either a half cent for public education by referendum. That's the only use it can be used for. But we're talking about school construction, community college construction, debt service for schools, as well as enhancements in teacher salaries or supplements. Same thing for community colleges. So you could do that, or have the ability under Article 43 to do that transit tax at 50 cents rather than a quarter on $100. But the problem here was, so that would be really good. The problem was, it would also at the same time eliminate our Article 46, which is the quarter-cent sales tax, which 27 of our counties out there have already enacted. Y'all would be grandfathered in, that wouldn't be an issue. But the problem with that is, if you're limiting this new Article 43A only to education, and you're taking away your ability to consider 46 in the future, then you can only use those dollars for education. And I'm thinking of Alexander County as an example, a little county straight north of us, a little to the west. They actually enacted Article 46, that quarter cent, to build a jail. So they actually got their voters to approve increase in sales taxes, because I believe they were under court order to build a new jail. And that's what they used those resources for. So obviously that would preclude our counties from having that flexibility, so that was a concern. But perhaps the biggest concern was throughout this new legislation as proposed in the Senate was in fact capping sales taxes at 2.5%. Most of our counties are at 2%. The 27 counties that have enacted Article 46 are to be at 2.25% now. But we have those counties, Mecklenburg being the #1. People from Mecklenburg, got anybody from Mecklenburg here? So they, in fact, got 43 enacted years ago because they got a half cent for public transit, and that's what they used to build that light rail. So they're already at 2.5%, and they were considering having a referendum in November to expand under Article 46 another quarter cent. They would be capped and precluded from doing that. Guilford, on the other hand, is looking at the referendum for Article 46. They can move forward in November because they are under 2.5%. So we're very concerned, first of all, that they would be capping our future authority for sales taxes. And even though we know we would have to go to the General Assembly to get authority to increase the authority that we have now, we think it's a bad precedent for having language in the general statute over and over and over again saying the cap is 2.5%, the cap is 2.5%. But even more than that, impacting Mecklenburg's plans already on the ballot and also impacting Wake. Do we have anybody from Wake here? They're considering both the half cent for transit. They're the last of the 3 triangle counties considering that, but also perhaps the quarter cent as well. And they would be precluded from doing both of those. They could do one or the other, they couldn't do both. And so that's problematic as well. So when this came out, we'd already seen copies of it and expressed some of our concerns about these particular issues. But in Senate Finance, they said, okay, fine, and they went ahead and passed it anyway. It was supposed to be voted on yesterday in the Senate floor, and because of all the controversy and the concerns, these people raised concerns because what it would mean is if you vote on education, you're precluded for transit monies. Now, our counties haven't, the 94 counties that only have a quarter cent, none of them have considered this as transit. They would use it for education, so that would in fact preclude them for having those monies for transit moving forward. So they weighed in. A number of the transit community activists weighed in. They pulled that from the Senate calendar yesterday. They're sending it back for finance for work. Again, we appreciate the General Assembly's recognition that our counties need help, especially if they're debating what could be upwards of an 8% teacher salary increase, because we know that we have to match it for those county-funded teachers, but also the impacts on the teacher supplements. So we appreciate that recognition, but again, limiting Wake's and Mecklenburg's ability to do what they have authority to is just a non-starter. So anyway, that's kind of breaking news there. It's been lots of fun this week having to deal with that particular bill. So I want to talk about where we are on the Senate and House budget negotiations. Because again, the principal purpose of the short session is to tweak the second year of the budget. And they tweak it based on, do they have new or less revenue? It's about the same because they did not meet revenue targets for last year. So they were able, they had enough reversions and such like that to manage that problem. But they didn't have the windfall that they anticipated. In fact, they had a shortfall. So here are the major differences keeping them in session right now. Focusing again on the level of teacher salaries. As you know, the Senate came out initially, we want to raise teacher salaries to 11%, one fell swoop. But we're going to cut teachers' assistants. We're going to cut that allocation, as well as making other cuts, including cuts in Medicaid eligibility and services to pay for it. Because it was as you can see, it's almost $500 million. So that was their initial proposal. The House came back, said, no, we'll go 5%. We're not going to cut Medicaid. We're not going to cut teachers' assistants. Okay? So there's been movement there. The House came back with 6%. The Senate responded with 8%. And all would be starting pay at $33,000 the first year, and I think it goes to $35,000 the next year. But again, also the funding. How are you going to do it? Senate still is now saying we'll cut half of the teachers' assistants. The House is still balking with that. They're especially balking in terms of the cuts in Medicaid services. The House wanted to raise lottery advertising, but then restrict where lottery advertising could happen. The Senate said no to that. And lots of discussion about what's going to happen with teacher tenure moving forward. The other huge debate in the General Assembly, this in fact happened this week, some of it came out, has to do with what is Medicaid going to look like moving forward. So that Medicaid Study Reform panel this past year, first of all proposed that we move the entire state to managed care. And across all of the Medicaid eligibility client groups, which is long-term care, mental health, and then any of the physical health of mothers and children. The provider community, the hospitals, the medical societies said, no, you're not. So they came back with another proposal around this accountable care organization. This is how Medicare actually organizes itself right now, and it's provider-led networks of care. We have community care here in North Carolina, and so what you do is you share, the state shares the risk and the benefits of reining in Medicaid costs with those accountable care organizations. And that's the Medicaid reform. They first started huge fights about how much money we need to pay for last year's Medicaid bills if we didn't have enough money, and moving forward this year. They did reach agreement to that. In fact, that happened right before the 4th of July, and everybody was just so delighted that there was finally a logjam break in the budget negotiations. They did it in public, and we thought, oh, they'll come back and have a budget in place and they'll be out of here by this week. That didn't happen. I'll talk about that. So, anyway, so the real concern here now is what is Medicaid going to look like moving forward. The House is firmly committed to the Accountable Care Act, all voluntary provider networks. That will be a capitated payment, but way out in the future, 2020. And the Senate says no. They just adopted their Medicaid reform package this week. It's going to be a combination of managed care and accountable care. We're going to do it across all of the Medicaid eligibles, long-term care, mental health, and physical. And so, of course, that's going to be a huge debate with the House, who's basically turned that down. The Hospital Association of Medical Society has already come firmly against the Senate plan as well. One thing I will point out, as we move forward in any discussion of Medicaid reform, and it is not going to go away, what we will have to deal with, and this is clearly stated in the Senate's plan, is looking at managed care moving forward. What is the county role in Medicaid eligibility determination? There is discussion afoot that, especially as everything's automated, why do we need the counties involved in Medicaid eligibility? I'm not saying that they're going to take that away from us overnight, but I see eventually that may change with these discussions. Now, those are the major differences. There's also a whole slew of other differences that we don't know what it's going to look like finally, because the only thing that the House and Senate conference committee members, the big chairs of the House and Senate appropriations, the only thing they're talking about is total dollar amounts across categories like justice and public safety and health and human services and education. They're not even talking about the nitty-gritty. And so here's a whole slew of things that are still being debated, considered. They haven't reached any resolution on any of these things. And some of them are fairly significant, like this very last. The Senate said, we're not going to fund drivers' education anymore. We're going to do it one more year with non-recurring funds, and then school districts are on their own. Now the House has said, no, we're not going to do that. So, I mean, that's a huge issue with about $50 million, I think, about it in state. Some of the good things in both of the budget proposals, it would provide a great deal more money for our child protective services, and this is in response to some unfortunate events that happened in some of our county DSS directors and social services agencies, whereby the children under their care were abused, and so that was difficult. But there's lots of discussion about changing the eligibility criteria for child care subsidies. That's going to impact your departments of social services, and your county commissioners will probably hear from clients who are now going to lose those services. There's general agreement about what it's going to look like, but again, nothing has been defined, and it all depends on what happens with teacher salaries in terms of what even dollars are going to be available for all of the other line items in the budget. Lots of discussion about what's going to happen with the SBI. It's definitely going to go to public safety. The crime lab is still up for grabs. The governor wants animal welfare pulled out of ag and stuck over in public safety as well, and tighten puppy mill standards, because that's something his wife wants, who's a SPCA advocate. With the fights going on between the governor and the House against the Senate, is that going to happen? I would say probably not. How does it impact us? Good news here, both the Senate and the House, even though counties really pushed, especially their House members, to increase the lottery funding for school construction. As you know, we're supposed to get 40%. We're getting about 20 now at $100 million. We had one of the big chairs in House Appropriations actually file a bill to return back to the 40% over time. 70 House members signed on to that bill. But again, all of the focus and all the new monies in lottery are going for teacher salaries. We were very happy to at least have $100 million set aside. And of course, we hope that sticks, because how are you going to fund 8% teacher salaries if that's what they agreed to? I know there was a lot of discussion about the House's provision. I'll talk briefly about that in terms of prohibiting pledging towards debt. As I mentioned, a great deal more money, but also state oversight and child protective services. One of the things that impact our counties who get more than their break-even point in the Medicaid swap back in 2007, not only those counties like Wake, for example, who gave up more in sales taxes than they received in Medicaid relief, not only they held harmless, but if all counties don't benefit by at least $500,000, the state sends them a check to bring them up to $500,000. So Wake got roughly, I think, about $4.5 million to bring them to zero, and then another $500,000 because that was the guaranteed benefit. We have a number of our smaller counties who, even though they were above even the break-even point, because they didn't get at least $500,000, the state would send them a check for about $400,000. That was going to Tyrrell County, some of the counties up in the Northeast. That's a huge amount of money for Tyrrell County. It was like 9 cents on their tax rate. But anyway, what the General Assembly has decided to do is phase that down, not to take away the money from Wake to bring them up to zero, but phase out that Medicaid benefit so everybody is at least zero. Is that, and that's, they can do that over 4 years and $125,000 increments. Both the House and the Senate agreed with the governor to shift all misdemeanors to county jails. Again, going through that voluntary statewide misdemeanor confinement fund. So it's your sheriffs that voluntarily participate in that program. I think last count we had about 51 counties doing that. So you receive the state inmates, and then you get payment on a daily basis for the housing of that. If there's medical care or additional supervision for travel and such like that, you get that reimbursed as well. Now they're going to be moving all of the misdemeanors, because we went, I think, from 90 days to 180 days. So all state misdemeanors will come to county jails, as well as DWI offenders, because that wasn't a part of the first group. And there are problems with the DWI offenders in that they require a great deal more services, because you have to provide some treatment aspects for them. The Sheriff's Association, which oversees the statewide misdemeanor confinement fund, says that they have enough money now to manage that population coming in for a couple of years, but I do have, my last slide shows you where some of that money may be going away. As you know, the governor, once again, because Governor Perdue tried to do this and we turned it back, shift to local education authorities, workers' compensation, and tort claims for school buses, and neither of the proposals had that, we're happy to say. The Senate wanted to restrict state dollars going for school nurses to Tier 1 counties. The House said no to that. And also to increase the county share of the forestry payments. The House said no to that. But then the House came out with what I think is probably the most problematic special provision in the House budget for sure, and that's once again sending forth a statewide contract for non-emergency Medicaid transport. I think I have a slide on that. Here's the impacts in detail. So I want to talk about the lottery funds. about pledging for debt service. The local government commission does not allow counties to pledge, officially pledge debt service now for school debt repayment. I know a number of our counties are using that, but you don't pledge it as a security, because you either do a general obligation bond where you're pledging the full faith and credit, or you do some sort of certificate of participation where you're actually pledging the facility. But our counties are relying on lottery dollars, and we have used as our mantra to, increase, put the money back where it's supposed to be. Certainly don't go below 100 million, because our counties have pledged this for debt service. Well, to shut us up, they're just saying, well, you can't pledge it for debt service going forward. So that's where that really comes from. But it does not impact your ability to use those lottery monies for debt service. So that's a different statute, so don't worry about that. And as I talked about, the Medicaid, that $500,000 sweetener is what I called it, that's going away, but it does not impact that bringing you up to zero. Okay, there's the House budget provision. This is something that was actually included in a budget a couple of years ago, directing the Department of Health and Human Services to do a cost-benefit analysis of how North Carolina transports Medicaid clients in a non-emergency situation. So these are Medicaid clients going for, say, medical appointments, as an example. And in North Carolina, we have a very coordinated, efficient system of transportation for human services, where that Medicaid client climbs on the bus with the senior citizen going for meals at the senior center, the kid going to daycare that we have to transport, the veteran perhaps going to a medical appointment. So all of those people ride in the same van, and they all share in the expense. Because of that, and based on the cost-benefit analysis, we were found to be the second cheapest state on a per person per month in the nation. I think 19 states responded. We were the second cheapest, below Utah, which had a special waiver for their Medicaid population. Another special provision required the department to actually bid it out to see if the bids coming in would be cheaper than what we're providing now, and there wasn't. We were actually the cheapest. We were about $1.73. The very next cheapest version of that was $1.80, and that was only in the urban areas. If they had to cover the entire state, it was almost $2. Well, the private contractor who could not show that his services would meet the $1.73, once again got in the House provision to direct the department, because here the department had the ability, if it's cost beneficial to contract that service out, do that. Well, is $1.73 lower than $1.80, $1.95? Yes, so it is not cost beneficial. But now the special provision would require the department to contract that out by January. So of course that's a huge concern with us, because of those riders on that bus, about 50% of revenues in many instances is coming from Medicaid. So if you pull that revenue stream out, the whole network could actually collapse. We're very concerned about that. Anyway, we understand it, and I call it the zombie provision because it keeps coming back and back and back, even though we've proved over and over and over again that we have the best system out there in North Carolina, but we understand it could be turned into a study, we hope. So where are we now? There is no agreement on the budget except for how much we're going to be spending on Medicaid and how much is available for lottery. Because as I mentioned to you, the House was saying we're going to raise our lottery advertising and we'll get about $30 million more out of that. So that's where they have agreement, which is a good thing, because you need to know how much you're going to spend on Medicaid, because it lets you know how much of that $21 billion is available for everything else. But that is the only thing they have agreement here in the week before they're supposed to go home. Because everybody's saying, oh, they're going home next week. Really? How are they going to deal with all these issues? So they couldn't reach agreement, so the House sent back a mini budget just with teacher salary increases, and the Senate didn't even vote on it. They sent it right back, and we'd never seen that before. So then they started having these public joint conference committees, because most of the conference committees are done behind closed doors. And sometimes there's good reason for that, because they can get very ugly, and people's feelings can get hurt. But if that's behind closed doors, none of the public sees it. You bring that out in the open, and then the tweets run amok about who said to whom, okay? So they brought this in to public committees. The very first one, they actually came to agreement about Medicaid, and that's where we're thinking, oh yeah, they're gonna have agreement, they're gonna go home next week. Well, then they had the next joint committee meeting, and you probably read about this. It was the House and Senate, and they were changing off who would chair specific 1 hour increments. It was a 2 hour meeting. So the House started, and they said, oh, we're going to have testimony from superintendents from around the state. And the Senate said, no, you're not. This is a committee with conferees, and those are the only ones allowed to talk. And so if you want us to recess and you can have your own committee meeting, then we will do so. And the House said, no, we're going to hear from these people. And that's when the Senate got up and left. So you saw that. So just the acrimony, and again, the hurt feelings. I've revised Tip O'Neill's famous "all politics is local" to "all politics is personal." It's going to take years to come and resolve some of those personal issues that are happening in these committees. So that was really, you had the good, and then you had the bad and really ugly. You heard that there were then threats that they would stay until Christmas. And so when they reconvened that afternoon, somebody put up a Christmas wreath and little stockings, and then the Senate Majority Leader walked around, Rules Chair, walked around with a bag of coal, which he distributed to House members. So at least we have a little bit of humor. Anyway, so now they're at the compromise scenario, 7 for the House, for the Senate, and the House at 5. And again, we're only talking about the major line item amounts. Think of your departments, the total amounts. You still have to figure out how much is going to go in each of those line items. You still have to figure out what's going to go on all the special provisions. And once that's done, if it is done, that conference report comes back up or down vote. And again, if they don't have a budget, they really already have a budget now. So that's kind of where they are with budget negotiations. I'm going to move next into some of the discussions of legislation impacting counties, some good, some bad. Good one here, we went into the General Assembly saying we're going to work 3 issues principally. This one here, jail dormitory standards, to allow all counties to have the same flexibility with the number of prisoners, jail inmates going into dormitories as the larger counties did, because it had a population threshold. Happy to say that that was passed out, so that was moving forward. I know a lot of y'all have heard about the pension spiking bill, and yesterday the Senate Pensions Committee actually met and heard it and gave it a favorable report. I imagine it's going to be on the Senate floor on Monday. I know there's been a lot of confusion about what this bill contains, particularly among our city and county managers. And one thing I will say, that we worked closely with the League and the Retirement Division and the Managers Association's Retirement Committee to craft something that would manage the more egregious cases of pension spiking out there while protecting the integrity of the system, and at the same time making sure that y'all who move up the ladder and get appropriate salary increases, or when you retire, your sick leave, changing a year, your vacation becoming a part of your compensation, that still continues. And I think we have that in House Bill 1195, the anti-pension spiking bill. It only is triggered by anyone making over $100,000. So you make a less than $100,000, don't worry about it. If you're already in the system, which obviously we all are here, except for our students, perhaps, don't worry about it, because if in fact you're shown to be pension spiked, your employer has to pay for it. But moving forward for new hires, the employee would be responsible for that. And again, it's a fairly complicated algorithm that if your salary, say you're making $100,000 and all of a sudden tomorrow you're making $150,000 and you retire tomorrow, well, your employee contributions to retirement and your employer retirement contributions are not enough to offset the cost of that. So y'all would be responsible of paying determining the actuarial impact of that decision. Now, the board could always rescind that change if they wanted to, and one of the things that we required is that the retirement division excuse me, would let our counties know if in fact there is a possibility of pension spiking because of an inordinate increase in salaries. Any questions there? Here is a bill, House Bill 1043, that actually came out of one of our goals that we were able to obtain on y'all's behalf last year, and that's to allow all counties and cities to consider design build as a new construction option. This had to do with pre-qualifications, which our counties don't use anyway, so we really didn't care about that piece, even though we had a commissioner on that panel. But we are going to point out that what was enacted and signed by the governor is the Blue Ribbon Commission to study building and infrastructure needs of the state. So what this commission will be doing is examining the needs for public school construction as well as water and sewer, and what are the, could there be a dedicated revenue stream to pay for these? So we're very pleased about this moving forward. Here's one, Union County. We're at Union County, and I know we had a couple of people registered. Y'all may recall back in January, the Union County lawsuit, the Union County School Board took the county to court around the whole litigation process for school budgets. The county differed from the schools by about, I think it was about $4 million in current expense. And the school board also wanted something like, what was it, 10 million, maybe $8 million in capital. The Board of County Commissioners said we cannot do that in one fell swoop. And mind you, Union County's debt service for public schools is one of the highest in the state. So it's not like they're not spending money for capital. So they said, but we will give you $3 million over the next 3 years to bring you to $9 million. The school board said no, took it to mediation. The court came out and found that the county, rather than having to spend $10 million, had to spend 10 times that. It was $8 million, and they had a court case founding of $80 million. That's a huge issue, and their senator, who's a former county commissioner, worked with us because he wanted to do something about it. And so it limits what for just a handful of counties moving forward, but I hope this sets the stage for us to get rid of the ability of your school boards to sue counties on sufficiency when it comes to funding. Because this is the only case where one body can sue another body for sufficiency. That school board cannot sue the state for sufficiency. Your sheriff's department cannot sue the county for sufficiency. We can't sue the state for sufficiency of lottery funds. So this is the only instance where one body can sue another one in terms of what sufficiency is towards funding. So it all applies to Union. Gaston, congratulations. Y'all got on that bill as well as Nash. So that's moved forward. But we do believe and hope this sets the stage to get rid of mediation altogether. We attempted first and foremost to have a statewide bill. Senate leadership told Senator Tucker from Union County, no, but you can move forward with a local bill, meaning up to 14 counties could sign on, but at the end it was only these 3. Some changes in backup requirements for your PSAPs, so they may be coming to you with plans for doing that. That moves forward. This is the one I talked about earlier, that bill that started out as Chihuahua and ended up as a study of Pluto. And again, what it would have required is counties and cities within 6 months to redact all personal information. We didn't even know what that was from county and city websites if asked by judges and DAs and non-elected officials and law enforcement. Because of, again, the huge impact on the banking industry in terms of mortgages, they worked with us and we turned that into a study. So we're happy about that. The Senate hasn't even considered that bill yet, as a matter of fact. Here's one that has been considered and enacted. Of course, that's a huge impact for our neighbors next door. As you know, there was a huge tax simplification act last year. I think it was House Bill 998 if I recall. This was to tweak that because when you write something that big, you're going to have to come back and change stuff because you didn't get it completely right. And you're going to have to clarify stuff. And that's what largely House Bill 1050 does. However, at the same time, what it does is repeal their authority for privilege license moving forward past next July. And even in this July, what started, it limited the assessment of that privilege license to only those businesses that were physically located within the city limits. At the same time, it actually reinstated in a drafting error from last year that, in effect, repealed their authority from last January. So it kind of stuck it back in there, took it away, and then limited it for this year. There's discussion. There was initial proposals that they would get $100 per business. That didn't stick. I know there's going to be some discussion in the interim with regards to the replacement of those revenues, which I think is about $60 million. It did repeal our authority for privilege license, but statewide, that was about $350,000, more than compensated for the expansion of the sales tax base in that Tax Simplification Act to amusements and some newspapers and dining hall food and such like that, which once fully implemented would raise about $30 million for counties. So we really didn't enter in that fray, but I know that's a huge issue for our neighbors next door. Now, unfortunately, one thing that's included in that has to do with the tag and tax program. The license plate agencies were able to convince a subcommittee of revenue laws that, in fact, their collection of property taxes are such that they should have that higher fee moving forward, unfortunately. Nice thing about it is we also realized another goal. Our counties have long sought Department of Revenue having the authority to actually do the assessment and listing of all the wireless communication facilities, much like they do with telecommunications and rolling stock of railroads and such, and that was improved in that as well. So that should maybe bring certainly more consistency. For those of you who heard Dr. Pat Mitchell's discussion yesterday, she mentioned that in fact legislation was enacted to create a public-private partnership for industrial recruitment moving forward. That's embodied in House Bill 1031. I did want to point out and include a little map. What it also does is put in statute this new concept of, they call them regional prosperity zones. And what that's going to do is regionalize state services. So you're going to have at least a member of the community college system there for you're going to have somebody from Diener, you're going to have there some commerce, Justice and Public Safety, Department of Public Safety. So there will be one office that your citizens can turn to, and frankly local governments can turn to as a way to mediate issues from those different departments in which they represent. But I think this also paves the way for perhaps regionalization of state services that counties now provide. I just want to draw your attention to that, but I'm always suspicious of anything. There are now some fines for elected officials serving on MPOs and RPOs if they do not file their statements of economic interest. It's now a misdemeanor. I'm going to talk about some things now that may pop out in the last waning days of the General Assembly. Right now, they've passed the House and they're kind of stuck in the Senate, and the Senate's trying to debate what might happen. These things are all around the regulatory reform bills. Here's one, Senate Bill 38. One of the nice things about it is, you know, last year's regulatory reform prevented our counties and cities from passing an environmental ordinance that was more strict in an area that was already regulated by the state or the feds, unless you had unanimous support by your board. And there was a moratorium up until October. This takes care of that, but it also standardizes some of the processes that our counties are responsible for. Here are some that are much more problematic, causing concerns. Senate Bill 734, again a rewrite from a Senate bill going over to the House as a PCS. And it really limits what your building inspectors can do to the point of even assigning them misconduct and neglect for being more enforcing at a higher standard than what's allowed under the building code. So that's kind of a concern. And then Senate Bill 493, again, another House rewrite of a Senate bill. I know this last one, allowing reheated food at lodging facilities, is something that your Public Health Directors Association is extremely worried about. Okay, I'm going to move over from legislation and talk about some statewide issues. As we know, we had tag and tax that started last September, and it combined the property tax collection with vehicle registration. Is something we saw way back and had it enacted in 2007 and maybe 2005, I can't remember now. It took this long to implement. And the reason we did it is because your motor vehicle property tax collection rates were 10 percentage points behind everything else. In fact, when I saw the fiscal summary this year, they had even dropped further in the last fiscal year. So we weren't getting better at collecting motor vehicle property taxes, we were getting worse. So we combined this system. We relied on a 3% interest surcharge for delinquent motor vehicle property owners to pay for the system. So that accumulated over all that time. Well, the system was put in. It actually was a state system that worked because it was contracted out with one of our vendors that actually does our property tax system. So that was good. So it worked, and it worked well, and it's out there now. But there were monies left over, $16.5 million nearly, which was just sent back to the counties, and y'all going to have to disperse it to the cities based on total property taxes you're collecting on their behalf in terms of motor vehicles. So that went out there. So that's good. One of the biggest concerns we heard initially is when this system went into place that counties were not collecting at the level they anticipated. In fact, it was about half of what you would normally see. And we were looking at the data and trying to figure out what was happening. We saw in the past that of the 7 million registrants, nearly 1 million, it may even be 2 million, registered late. But 1 million of those registered the first month after they were actually late. So it was like, oh my gosh, I didn't register my car on time, I better get there. And then over time, that other 1 million would eventually register. So what happened with the data, instead of all that million of the 2 million registering that next month, it was pushed way out. But now what we're seeing in terms of tax collections, rather than collecting on average at about 55 in the old system, we're now collecting 67 million monthly, and DOR has set the estimate of about $100 million more for this year, so we're happy about that. And you get to keep that 3% moving forward. NC Fast, and I know this has been a terrible issue for your departments of social services, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. So let me be real clear about that, because the food stamps where we were in arrears and we were being threatened with losing our administrative dollars, it was easy compared to Medicaid, which is so much more complicated. And what's also complicating is the Affordable Care Act and all of those new applications coming in through the exchange, because the applications are incomplete and duplicative, and so your social services are having to scramble to get the information to determine whether or not they're eligible, and their best guess, only 10% in fact are eligible. So a couple of months ago we were looking at 90,000 Medicaid apps in arrears, either the new applications coming through ACA or the old applications require certification. The department sought a waiver to having to use NC Fast for the recertifications. They got that approved in December. They also were able to get 75% monies for reimbursement. We were at 50-50. Every dollar the county put into administration of Medicaid got back 50 cents from the feds. Moved that up to 75%, but that's only for processing within NC Fast. But what they're trying to do is get that also for any of the recertifications being done in EIS over the next 6 months. They have not heard back favorably from the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, the federal agency that oversees the Medicaid program. At the same time, we just received a letter last week from CMS saying, we are very concerned about your Medicaid backlog. Now, we could have gotten a really nasty letter, which 6 other states received, saying, we're really concerned about your backlog and we're going to do something about it. This one, they're just come and study the causes, so at least we're not under any threat of losing administrative dollars at this time. But I am concerned about the huge workloads facing your departments of social services. Some good news about NC Fest, the food stamp process is finally stabilized. It takes a lot longer to process an application because your workers are having to key so much more data. Because, you know, it used to be you put a little bit of information in the food stamp system, most of it was in your files where you would handwrite stuff. All of that's now being automated, so it's taking longer for the eligibility piece moving forward, but it should reap benefits in the back when new systems come on board and they can share that data. The Medicaid is still kind of quirky. It's improving now, but we know that the department required all of your social services agencies to come back with a plan about how they're going to manage that backlog in Medicaid. Happy to say that they've managed about 30% of that through 1st of July, so that's good. Any questions about that? I wish it were better, but it's not. Oop, I'm running out of time. Want to point out that both the House and Senate have full implications of further consolidation of your mental health MCOs. So this is what it's going to look like eventually. I think it's a couple of years out, but just I wanted y'all to be prepared for that. And also wanted to point out, we were talking about all misdemeanors from the state prisons now coming to the county jails, and we put in some new fees a couple of years ago to manage that through the statewide misdemeanor confinement fund. A court suit just found on behalf of the Richmond County Board of Education, they said that $50 equipment malfunction fee was in fact a fine, and it should go to schools, and the court said, yeah, you're right. So it may be appealed or it may not, but that does threaten the stability of that system moving forward. About 40% of the revenue stream is dependent upon that. I want to spend the next couple of minutes talking about our expansion of research efforts at the County Commissioners Association. In fact, this is our new logo. You can see, you've probably seen some documents coming out of that. The focus really is to be the center of county-based research in North Carolina. So when you have questions about how do I look to my peers, here I need some data very quickly, that you have one stop in which to pull down the data, and also in terms of data analysis about some of the major things impacting county government. Here are the components of it, and they all kind of build on one another, kind of in a clockwise phase. As you know, we do a number of primary surveys, principally our budget and tax survey that we're using, our tax rate survey, and I'll show you the results from that for this fiscal year. We've got some white papers, especially I want to point out one on the basics of county finance and budgets that you can use for your community groups, but also in terms of the county's role in public school finance. And I've actually done a PowerPoint in front of the Joint Education Committee of the General Assembly that may help you answer some of the sticky questions about the county's role in finances. So all of this is going to be building on to eventually we're going to get is the annual state of the counties, much like the governor does the state of the state, the president of the State of the Union, state of the counties, with regards to what are the specific issues impacting counties, where we are economically, financially, and programmatically. Here is the website we've set up off of our homepage. There's a button by itself that says Center for County Research, and we're organizing the data so you can find it a lot more efficiently and effectively. For those of you who are doing the tax referenda or considering it under the county sales tax referenda, that's for Article 46. If you have questions about the process and that, you can get lots of information as well as which counties have successfully passed it as opposed to those that have had referenda. And I want to point out that here are the results of the county tax rate survey. It's going to be published in County Lines. It may have already just come out. We're still having a number of counties having to increase property taxes to manage growing services, particularly when it comes to schools. I'm still concerned that a number of our counties their property tax bases dropped fairly significantly during the Great Recession starting in 2008, such that your sales assessment ratio, which is just that, the selling price of property in your county versus the assessed valuation, that in fact the assessed valuation is still higher than a number of what's being sold in your communities. So when you do revaluation, you may see an actual drop in the value rather than an increase that we've always seen historically, and that's causing a number of our counties for their revenue neutral rate to actually increase that property tax rate to generate enough of those revenues. So I'm still concerned about that. So we now have 65 counties that are in fact underwater is what I would call. Next steps, in the fall what I'm going to be doing, and I'd like some volunteers from the budget officials, is what I'm going to focus on is environmental scan about what are the frequently asked questions either you're getting from your board, you're getting from your community, questions about data access and availability that you find it very difficult to answer. Because that's where we want to hone our research efforts in terms of compiling that data and presenting it to you in such a way that makes sense for you. Again, easy access, easy analysis. We're going to do an environmental scan. I'm going to involve some managers, budget officials, and finance officers, because I think they're the really key data users in our counties as the initial environmental scan to really pinpoint what are the data elements that y'all need moving forward. So need some volunteers moving forward. And with that, I am done. Got 5 minutes, I think, before we break. Questions, comments? Anybody? What's happening?
Is there any additional clarity on how the state is going to determine whether or not we've met that public health mandate this year, or mandate?
Well, y'all, and what Michael's referring to is a part of the Health and Human Services Consolidation Bill. The sponsor of that required a maintenance of effort from our counties for health spending based on, I think, the 2011 and compared to what was appropriated in July 1, 2010 versus what was appropriated July 1, 2014. I met early on with the department last year to assess how they were actually going to benchmark that. They were going to use their WORM system, I forget exactly what WORM stands for, as a measure of the monies that the counties had invested. They found a number of counties not meeting that, but the counties looked at that data. I'm thinking of Buncombe significantly because I think y'all were like $4 million off, and it's like, really? And they found like the data coming from the WORM was not a reliable measure moving forward. So we worked with the department, and one of the things that y'all can do is show a budget ordinance, saying here's where we were there, here's where we're at. There's also the languages in terms of being supported by ad valorem dollars. You can show where the ad valorem dollars were fees or sales taxes and such like that. Michael, after that data went out and our counties were able to respond to the department, I've not heard any concerns since that time. So if there are still some concerns about that, I would like to hear about it. Because as you know, the penalty would be to withhold state funding, which there's not very much, I think it's $30 million, but the federal dollars are like $150 million. Questions?
So like going forward, if we're in the process of reorganizing the health department and in terms of what's mandated, what's not, are we still going to be held to that?
Katie, that's a great, and I put this in the fiscal forecast, by the way. So if you look at that, you can see some of the components the department's going to take into account. Mandated services, you're obviously going to have to fund. But if it was nice to have, or if you were finding other providers for that services, they are willing to understand what's happening in your communities, particularly those counties that are undergoing consolidation and have managed to streamline some of the administrative costs. They don't want to withhold your dollars, so they're looking for any justification not to do that. And if we have a huge issue with that, and all of a sudden all counties lose federal and state dollars, well, obviously that maintenance of effort requirement is not going to hold.
One last follow-up question on that. Is there a adjudication process that we can go through? I mean, if they're,
I asked them to put a formal process in place. What they have done is said they will, again, hear from the counties about justifications for a drop in the county dollars going forward. As an example, Surrey County is a great poster child here. Basically, in that time, they spun off their home health services, okay? They're not going to be penalized for that, as an example. Other questions, comments? Well,
Are you
Pam?
restricted from amending the health budget down after it's been adopted?
Well, it speaks to appropriations, okay? We'll leave it at that. And we know there's a difference between appropriations and expenditures. So, leave it at that. Y'all, I hope you know that you can call or email me at any time if you have a question, if you've got an issue with a state agency that you can't resolve yourself, because if you're having that issue, chances are some other county's having that issue. I can't represent your needs in the 7 months I have left until I retire next May unless we hear from you. And so it is very important that when something comes up or if you have a question, do never feel like you are bothering me or I don't have the time. If I'm right in the midst of dealing with something like House Bill 1224, it might take a little bit of time to get back to you. But when I'm sitting in the Senate and House gallery, I have nothing better to do than respond to emails. So never feel like it's an imposition, because that's why I'm there. That's why we're there. We're your association. We're your staff. We are there to answer your questions and your concerns because that's our job. So never feel like, oh my gosh, it's such a silly question. I feel bad about calling Rebecca or emailing her. No, don't ever feel that way, because that's why we're there. And with that, Frank, I think we're done.